So we now have Dean and Brian from Sawtooth Software, who are going to talk about a novel approach to identifying poor respondents in survey.
Thank you very much. So yeah, thanks for the introduction, JT. Today, me and Brian are going to take you through potentially a new way for you to identify some poor quality survey respondents. I had some introduction slides, but thankfully, I think most of it's already been covered by everyone else today several times over, so I won't spend too much time on them. But I think we can all agree we've got a problem, and everyone's starting to realize that now, which means hopefully everyone's going to start and take action now. Part of this is because we've created a commoditized industry with the panels where we've got the lowest common denominator, the lowest cost wins. We're not caring for respondent experience, as we've just seen. And this is facilitating a rise in fraud, ultimately. And part of this is bots. This is taken from a YouTube video. It had about 5,000 views at the time. But a student had created a bot to answer surveys on their Pulse site. It's taking in sentences, random sentences, it's pasting them into open ends. It's configured so it doesn't answer questions too quickly, so it doesn't get flagged by speeders. But it's really simple. And this is just available on the internet for anyone to look at and play with it and go through themselves. So that's part of the problem that we're facing. But it's not the only problem that we're facing. As we've heard, we've got bots, we've got survey farms, we've got inattentive respondents who are just doing something else and aren't really that focused. And to me, all of this is survey quality. Whether or not it's fraud, it's up to you. Potentially, if you're getting paid for a survey, but you're doing it while you're shopping and you're just clicking on anything, sounds a bit like fraud to me. And at the Sawtooth Software Conference last year, one of our attendees identified 5 key archetypes of fraud, and one of them was bots. These bots are getting really sophisticated. If you plug ChatGPT into that, this is getting to a really scary situation where even the open ends that we had before aren't going to be a reliable way to find them out. We've got hackers or survey farms. They're manipulating the devices to access surveys multiple times. They're just doing it purely to churn out these incentives, and that's also not good. We've got con artists. They've got multiple personas. They're gaming screeners. They're trying to find how they can get through that survey so that they can access that incentive, and they don't really care about the results they're giving you. They just want to get through it. We've got pros. These guys can do 40 surveys a day. They're probably not going to give you as much as nonsense results as the rest of them, but do you want to be that 40th survey in the day? Is that really going to give you quality results? Probably not. And the final one, the one that felt like it was the only one we used to deal with back in the day, is the slackers. These guys are lazy, they're flatlining, they're not really thinking about any surveys or any questions, they're just breezing on through. But now they're almost the least of our problems, when they used to be the bulk of our problems. So we need to sort things out, and we can't expect panels to do everything. It's easier for us to sit here and blame the panels and say they need to increase all of their resources to make sure they fix this problem. They can help with bots and hackers, but for the other 3 archetypes, the community as a whole needs to focus on what it can do to solve that. And a lot of it is just going back to basics. We've heard today people talking about speeders, straight liners, red herring questions, consistency questions, adding these things into making sure that you're getting high quality responses as well as non-fraudulent responses. But we can add some new ones to this. We've heard a lot about open ends, so asking someone to summarize the survey at the end. A bot probably can't do that yet, unless it's kept a record of every single question that's been asked throughout it. An inattentive respondent probably would struggle to do that, but someone who is a high quality respondent will be able to tell you what you've been asking them about. Another simple one is screeners. Don't terminate someone at the point at which they've failed, because people can game that. They can identify they need to be over 18 and under 65 by you screening them at that point. Do it at the end of the section, and then they don't get that information, so the con artists can't use a multiple persona to get through to that point. We can add honeypots. So if you've got bots that are trying to fill in every single box on a screen, just put a box on there that's hidden from a standard human respondent, and a bot will fill it in, but you won't get any data there from any other respondents. And then the one that we're here to talk about today is utilizing the RLH score from a max diff analysis. And we'll talk through how we can use that to identify not only fraudulent responses, but poor quality responses as well. Thanks, Brian.
So, is this on? So we started talking about this a bit more at Sawtooth last year, and I think since then, I think I saw it. I was going to point right there. She's not there. The Insights Association, I think this is now on their recommended list of things to do is using this technique. So I'm just going to run through the technique in general. Just out of curiosity, how many people have heard of max diff? Okay, how many people have done a max diff in their own surveys? Okay, so about half. All right, good. We're not wasting too much time then. So, rating scales are a common source of our, our general attempts to take feelings and put them into numbers. Because once we get numbers, we can do math and we can summarize and things like that. But this, the standard complaint is that you often get really poor quality answers from rating scale questions. If you start going into psychology and things like that, you just find there's so much written about how poor rating scale questions are. People don't use them equally. Someone in Germany uses it differently than someone in America. You should be standardizing, but hardly anyone does because you don't want to have to explain standardizing to the person you're presenting to, and things like that. So there's lots of problems with them. So very little discrimination, scale use bias. There's halo effect, and then if you're trying to do anything with it, if you're trying to predict and say like, how does a scale determine likelihood to purchase or something like that, it's almost impossible to build any sort of forward-looking thing. Now, I'm not saying never use them. I think there's a lot of situations of like customer satisfaction and things like that, star rating scales. I think there's looking backwards, I think they're okay, but particularly if you're trying to figure out what people are going to do in the future, rating scales fail quite often. So one option is doing paired comparisons. This is people have already alluded to this of asking better questions, right? So paired comparisons are great. They're typically very easy for people to answer. You force differentiation in people's answers. You can't say both are equal. You have to choose one is better than the other, even if they're both good or they're both bad. So paired comparisons are a really effective way if you're trying to create that differentiation in people's answers as you cycle through things. And that's my little comic that I like there. But it gets rid of a lot of these problems. So they're easy, forces differentiation. There's no scale. And again, if you go into psychology and other forms of measurement and things like that, despite the fact that you're only gathering ordinal data, if something is better or worse, if you repeat that and you take a sample or things like that, you can produce metric data that we can do our math on. We can do averages and we can come up with scores and do significance testing and things like that, despite the fact that you didn't initially ask a metric scale, which is really cool. Okay. The drawbacks of these, of course, is that the scalability issue. There's a little generalized formula here. So if we had 20 items, there are 190 possible comparisons. Maybe a bit easier than the 99 open ends on hoovering, but still not a great experience. So that naturally leads to the next step, the next evolution of can we do a better job than asking a whole lot of paired comparisons, because people want to ask about a lot of stuff. People want to ask more questions than less, especially if you're dealing with a client. So that's where MaxDiff kind of came into existence. So the idea here is, instead of showing a paired comparison, we're going to stick a couple of the items from our list. Typically like 4 or 5 is what most people do. We're going to ask some question and which is the most important feature and least important to feature. And this is kind of where the name comes from, is we're asking people to identify the two items on the ends of the scale that produce the maximum difference in whatever the scale is that we're measuring. Depending on what background you come from, if you're a bit more like econ type world, you'll hear this called best worst scaling more. Pretty much the same thing. We don't really differentiate too much between the two, but MaxDiff is what kind of came into the marketing world first. So the respondent sees these questions. They choose one is the best, one is the worst, most important, least important. And then from that, we can infer all of the other paired comparisons. So if the person says automated usage analytics is best, we know that that's better than the other three. And if they choose free dashboard is the least important, we know that the other three are better than that. And so the only one we miss out is the stuff in the middle. So it's a very efficient question. We get a lot of the same benefits of paired comparisons, but we get a lot of them just from the easiest type of question to ask. Because people are really good at identifying extremes. It's really easy for us to say, something is best or something is terrible. It's the stuff in the middle that is hard and has a lot of respondent error. So it's great. So generally, if you're thinking about modeling data, generally the consensus, other people have shown, we have shown, I'm not just blowing smoke, we've got white papers and all sorts of good stuff, but generally you shoot to ask each item 3 times. So typical MaxDiff exercise, you have a pool of 20, you will show maybe 4 or 5 at a time, and we rotate through, so we show all the items against all the other items, and you do a nice balanced design. So people see things multiple times. That produces good differentiation and a good model for predicting what people will then choose. And so normally we do this approach just in general. We're going to show each item multiple times because we want to reinforce and create differentiation and everything like that. So the benefits is that, again, the questions are relatively easy. We do on Pi Day, March 14th, we do an internal survey, and it's the hardest survey I ever take because we put like 30 pies in there, and you have to choose the best and the worst, and then we go out and we buy all the bests. And
these are
Pi
American
Day.
pies, though, not British ones, so they're all
sorry.
sweet.
Sweet pies, yeah. So it's really hard because every single page there's 5 delicious pies, and you have to say which one is the best and worst. But generally they're pretty easy. So forced differentiation, no scale use bias. We still create scores that indicate the relative desirability, that it's not just rank ordering. So normally this is what we're shooting for. This is the kind of the point of running the MaxDiff, is take a big list of things, put them on a scale, don't just sort them, but create difference between the items. So that's usually what we're using MaxDiff for. But the really cool part is because it's a regression-based model, we get a fit statistic. Okay, so normally like this is just a comparison here of like 5-point rating scales is the light green, the grayish bluish part is the MaxDiff score. This doesn't happen all the time, but it's pretty reliable that you're going to get like lumps and more differentiation. And again, we've got a white paper showing that it's more than just rank order data. It does produce these lumpy groups of data. Okay, but the fit statistic is what we're pushing kind of a bit more lately as a really, really good metric for respondent quality.
And at this point, I'd like you all to get your phones out, please, because you can test it yourself. So we've programmed a MaxDiff study. Hopefully the QR code works through. It's not too far away. And this is basically a survey on locations for a conference. And you can complete that however you like. You can be perfectly attentive. You can complete it perfectly randomly. You can do it without giving it any attention whatsoever. And at the end, it will tell you how you were behaving. So it calculates this consistency metric on the fly and says, actually, no, you're a random responder or you're a good responder. So this is the technique that we're suggesting using in this session. So I'll just give people a little bit of time to do that. There's only 10 tasks, so hopefully it won't take too long. I'm not watching for speeders on this one. And the reason this works is because, as Brian said, we are creating a regression model at an individual level. So we're creating a model for every single respondent that does the task. And when you create a regression style model, you can get what's known as an R-squared, or in this case, it's called a root likelihood score. And this ranges from 0 to 1. And because we know what a random respondent would do, we know what the floor is for being a good respondent. So we can use it. And if we look at what a random respondent would be, so if we had 4 items in a MaxDiff task, then a random respondent would be able to predict what they were doing 25% of the time, because it'd get lucky once. But a better respondent would be better than that. So if we had 3 items per task, a random respondent would be right 33% of the time. If we had 5 items, it'd only be right 20% of the time. And what we found is if we simulate 1,000 random respondents, 80% of their time, their RLH score is below 0.4. So we can model this and understand this. And we've done a lot of research on this. So we created a lot of synthetic data where we're looking at, okay, let's program 1,000 respondents to answer to a pattern. So we know we should be able to predict what they do correctly. And we'll program 1,000 respondents who are completely random. So they should mirror sort of 25% if we had 4 items there. And we looked at, okay, what is the threshold here? So if we wanted to identify 95% of the random responses, we'd get a false positive of around 5% if we had a lot of items in our list, or 10% if we had smaller items in our list. But if we are happy with only collecting 80% of those random responses, we're only getting a false positive rate of between 1% and 2%. So even where half of our sample are random, we're only throwing away around 1% of good respondents in order to get rid of around 80% of bad respondents. So that's a pretty good trade-off in my book. And we've got a lot of research as well within Sawtooth. So our website is largely white papers of research on research and techniques. But we found that actually if you do answer a MaxDiff inconsistently and you do have that low RLH score, this is highly correlated with traditional bad survey behavior. So speeders, flatliners, inattentive responses. So it shows that pulling out these people is going to be beneficial to the quality of the survey overall. So yeah, bad data comes in many forms, but if we add MaxDiff, which is going to add value to our surveys anyway in general, we can use it to help identify those people on the fly, get rid of them pretty quickly. You're not running a model at the end and then removing people after the fact. Thank you very much.
Thank you, gentlemen, and perfectly on 20 minutes. You must have rehearsed it. Do we have questions for the Sawtooth? If we do, Corinne, I'm going to take this one over. Share a mic, guys.
No, this one's on. It's okay.
Yeah. So to the earlier point about survey length. To the earlier question about survey length. Sorry. How much time are we adding to a survey?
So you can do it in 2 ways. So
sorry, if the respondent answers properly.
Yeah. So there's sort of 2 ways you can utilize a MaxDiff in this way. So you can add a MaxDiff purely for the reason of getting rid of people. You'd probably want to do that with a small amount of items. So you probably have 7 items there. If you're showing people 4 at a time, you're showing it 3 times. That's probably 5 MaxDiff questions, 5 or 6 MaxDiff questions to get that RLH score. So that's not too much. So it's 10 clicks. It's not horrendous. Or you can utilize a MaxDiff on a question you were going to use a rating scale or a ranking scale for.
But if you take the former route, how long are we talking?
So, what's the average MaxDiff question?
So it's going to depend on like the length of the stuff that you have in there
Yeah, but
and things like that. But generally,
say that we did it. Let's say that and I completely get it. I mean, I use MaxDiff a lot, but and if it's embedded as part of the questionnaire, that's great. But if you want to do it up front, almost as a filter to be able to, filter people out earlier on, you're talking like 30 seconds, a minute?
30 seconds to a minute, I'd
Okay.
say. I wouldn't say,
Yeah.
because you want to keep a small, you're not doing 30 item
Yeah,
max diff,
yeah.
you're doing 7 items, each item 3 times, so it
Yeah.
wouldn't take too long in that.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, we've got we probably should have put them in there, but there's a paper we have that compares the length of the interview. I think it's our main paper on MaxDiff that compares it against a couple other things: rating scales, ranking questions, a queue sorting exercise, MaxDiff, and I think there's one other one that talk about the length. So generally, you're like 2 to 3 times as long with the MaxDiff questions. But if you're doing a shorter exercise, then yeah, you should be under a minute. You see really large learning curves on respondents. So like the first question takes them 10 seconds because they're orienting. It's a different question type and things like that. And then you see a 30% drop in the time. And by the third question, people have kind of cut their time about in half, and they're only taking 5 seconds per question because it's click click, and they've oriented themselves and things. So it's usually not too bad.
Quick question here. Ray, 1 second.
Thank you. Dean, I think you mentioned about doing the summary of the survey at the end of the survey. The problem I have with things like that is we have so few respondents willing to give us information already, and then the ones that are giving us information, we're penalising them by them proving that they're actual respondents by doing it. So I wasn't sure, are you suggesting using mathematical or statistically sound techniques instead of those type ones, or a combination of?
I think we're at a point where we need to use any tools we've got. And I think we all need to start incorporating as many as we can in surveys to try and trick them, because the bots are getting smarter.
Sure.
So yeah, we are penalising good quality people, but you kind of need to do that in order to make sure the quality is high.
Are you employing techniques now that you'll only do those in cases where you consider them to be suspicious, or would you just put them in?
I'd advocate for having a simple max diff in pretty much any survey where you want to get rid of poor quality respondents. For the sake of a minute survey time, you've got a statistical model which says whether they're answering with a specified pattern or whether they're just not really paying attention. I think that's key. But again, speeders, straight liners, all that sort of stuff, we can't move away from it, unfortunately.
I think too it depends on the source as well. So in one of the papers where we looked at identifying random people and disengaged people, one of the surveys we had a 1% flag rate, and it was because it was an employee survey. So it was just the employer was getting feedback from the employees. So the employees were all highly motivated to take the survey well, and all of them were very attentive, right? So I don't think, it's going to depend a bit on the motivation, and that, that speaks to the larger theme of like when people feel like their input matters and they're engaged a bit more and things like that. Maybe some of this stuff isn't quite as necessary, right? It's unlikely we're going to get bots in an employee feedback survey, right? So it really does depend, I think. But what we've seen a lot is, like other people have said, you don't want to just do one thing and then base your cleaning off that one thing, right? Particularly with the open ends, I think it's great to provide an opportunity for people to give feedback at the end of the survey. Was there anything that was confusing? Was there... And then you could put that question at the end there of like, could you just give us a summary, and maybe it feels a little bit less of like a insulting thing if it's at the end of a feedback type thing. Maybe I'm hypothesizing. I haven't tested it or anything, but that's my thought.
So quick points. The first one, coming back to what Deborah and Melanie were saying earlier, this would identify data you don't want in your study. It wouldn't identify whether it was inattentive, fraudulent, or whatever. So when you reject it, you wouldn't necessarily want to go back to your database and mark these people as fraudulent. And it does add one addition. If you go back into some of the old papers, there's a white paper at Sawtooth from me where we look at an additional source of low score there, which is where people's views change. So some people, if you ask them those 10 destination questions, will start marking Belfast in the middle. And as the 10 questions go, you know what? I really don't like Belfast. And they'll put it at the... So you get an evolution of views that also generates a low consistency score. It's not inattentive, it's just that they're not suitable for that question. For MaxDiff, it's relatively small. When we used to do it for conjoint, it was much bigger. It was about 10% of people were not consistent, but they were attentive.
And I think that there's been other presentations. There was just one. I don't think it's posted on our website. So we just had another conference in Barcelona. One of the things there, I think, was trying to look at attribute non-attendance in conjoint models to try to say, like, if you take things out, like, does it actually matter? So there are other more advanced things to try to get at, like, but it goes back into the same conversation. I wouldn't, if someone was wishy-washy in the conjoint or something like that, that's one strike. You're not out until you hit 2 or 3 or something like that. Another interesting thing is in that presentation from last year that you can go read. One of the interesting things they found is that some bots answer with normal distribution, some are random, some are a little trickier. One of the ones they found is when they did some clustering on the MaxDiff data, they found this cluster, really confident pattern answers, right? Not random. But if you sorted the scores best to worst, it was the longest thing was number 1, and the shortest MaxDiff was the worst, and it went longest to shortest. Yeah, it's like I can't remember who said it, but like you got to kind of applaud a little bit that they came up with a little rule. So it does go back to that earlier presentation that Savanta and I can't remember the other company. Yeah, looking at it, right? You can't like sort it, cluster it, look at multiple bits and like, does this make sense? We don't unfortunately have a solution for that yet. Maybe ChatGPT will be able to do some quality checks and do some of that stuff eventually, but you still have to do that even with this. And you'll find, and that's how they found that weird pattern of like, this doesn't, the items, aren't clustering right, and then they discovered it was longest to shortest, and if nobody had taken the time to look at that, they wouldn't have known that they had a bot farm hit their survey.
And that's also the reason why the threshold of identifying those random respondents was set at 80% and not at 95%, because we don't want to chuck out the baby with the bathwater either.
Gents, one more question. There's actually 2, but you sure you don't want to do yours? Okay. John, you've got a whole session in a bit. You can't wait.
Yes, I was wondering whether I might help my thoughts to that session, but it's a bit of a Schrodinger's cat problem. By the very process of measuring this, the process of doing a MaxDiff is quite boring. Oh. And so I'm boring respondents. By the very process of measuring them, I am now creating a problem which is part of... How do you resolve that?
I would blame the agencies for using lists that were too long rather than the technique.
There's an interesting quote. So Sawtooth Software's founder Rich Johnson recently passed away. Brian Orm, the current president, did a really nice kind of tribute. One of the interesting things is that when they started doing early conjoint methods and Sawtooth did an adaptive thing, someone described it as playing a game of chess with the computer. I think there are opportunities for some gamification. I think I haven't played around with it much, but I think, for example, telling someone I'm gonna show you your score at the end. I'm hypothesizing here, but giving people some feedback, trying to raise that level of like, we're gonna tell you what your top 1 items are or something. Like I've seen that before of like treating it almost like a recommender type thing and say at the end I'm gonna show you what we think your top 3 things are. Some of that stuff can raise the level of involvement and engagement. I think there's opportunities for that. But I wouldn't necessarily say a MaxDiff is more boring than a battery of rating scales or rank order questions or something. So I wouldn't necessarily agree that we're extra boring them by doing this method or anything like that. I've taken a lot of really bad rating scale surveys before.
Gentlemen, thank you very much for your time.